Hello, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival, and I am delighted to be the one who gets to welcome you here tonight to see Marilyn Robinson appear for her book Jack. She's joined tonight by C. Pam Zhang, whose book How Much of These Hills is Gold came out in April of this year. We are so delighted to be working, the Wisconsin Book Festival, to be working with literary arts and the Portland Book Festival, the Believer Festival through the Black Mountain Institute, and the Loft's Wordplay on bringing this nationwide, and I was just telling both Marilyn and Pam, international audience together tonight. So thank you all for being here. I also just want to take a moment to thank the Madison Public Library and the Madison Public Library Foundation. They have been stalwart in their support of free cultural events throughout the pandemic. This is about the 8th festival that we put on with the Wisconsin Book Festival at Madison Public Library, and they've never wavered in the knowing about the importance of bringing these things to people. So thank you to them and to all the sponsors for all 4 organizations for bringing these together, and of course to Marilyn and Pam for being here tonight. It is one of those introductions that sometimes you get to give where everyone who's here, I'm sure, knows who Marilyn Robinson is. Pulitzer Prize winner, National Humanities Medal winner, National Book Critics Circle Award winner twice, Orange Prize. I'm sure there are more. But really for me, it is truly an honor to kind of marry where I started in events and how I've gotten to where I am. I was just telling Marilyn that her event in 1998, 1999 in Iowa City was one of the first events I ever went to as a freshman at the University of Iowa. And the aura of the room and the way that people talked about it in the street about, you have to go see Marilyn, you have to go see it, just kind of took me away. And Iowa City is a special place for how much love people give to books. And I know Pam spent some time there as well. And so everyone can relate, but is truly remarkable to now be grown up and professional and be welcoming you tonight, Marilyn. So thank you so much. And I will step away. Take it away, Pam and Marilyn.
Thank you for that introduction, Connor. As Connor mentioned, Jack is a book that fans of Marilyn's work have been looking forward to for a very, very long time. In fact, for so long that in a 2008 interview, someone at the Paris Review asked you if you would ever write about Jack, and you said, I quote, you said no, and you said, I quote, "I would lose Jack if I tried to get too close to him as a narrator. He's alienated in a complicated way. Other people don't find him comprehensible, and he doesn't find them comprehensible." So I just wanted to start off by asking, what changed between 2008 and when you began working on this new novel?
Well, I find that the characters of the books that I write live on in my mind, and the character of Jack sort of spontaneously developed itself in a way that made me feel that I actually could speak from his point of view, write from his point of view. Um, it, it wasn't a decision on my part. It was just the realization that in some way or another, I had reached a conclusion about that,
Do you feel that he is a more complicated character than the narrators in your other novels?
I would not make that comparison. Yes is the answer, but I hesitate to make the comparison. I think, to the extent that I have captured plausible people, I've captured also a degree of complexity that I have not done justice to, in every case.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, on that note of complexity, is really interesting because I think that when I first entered into my experience of reading this novel, I thought, oh, I understand this is going to be a love story. And like most love stories, the main point of tension will be between the two characters who are romantically involved. And what was really fascinating to me is I quickly realized that, in fact, one of the greatest sources of dramatic tension in the novel for me was Jack himself, right? He is full of these contradictions where he calls himself the Prince of Darkness. He says he's trouble. but at the same time, we only see him act with, you know, the utmost gentleness and thoughtfulness towards Della, the woman that he's in love with. So could you talk about this tension and this sort of like engine of Jack's his own identity that drives the novel?
Well, the experience that he has had of himself is this sort of attraction toward fragility as or vulnerability or whatever. It somehow or other seems like a test of experience, a reality to him, to break things, to steal things, to, you know, this is something that's been true of him as long as as he can remember. Um, and you know, he doesn't intend these things as acts of evil or anything. He's somehow, and as I understand him, estranged and ill at ease simply in reality itself, you know, especially as it takes firmer and harder and more inscrutable social forms. Um, so, you know, he's somebody who is aware of his destructiveness, but the overarching subject of the book for me is that destructiveness is unacknowledged but pervasive in all kinds of situations, and he is sensitive to it, but the more violent aspects of the culture, the more destructive elements of it occur among people who would not think of themselves in those terms. You know, the city fathers who will pull down the Black neighborhood and so on, you know.
Yeah, it is interesting because we see Jack, in fact, I think we see him in scene more often the victim of acts of destruction than the perpetrator of acts of destruction, right? We see him beaten physically, I think, a number of times. We see him sort of insulted to his face because he is considered this outsider of society and looked down upon. So that's really interesting that you note that. Yeah, I think that what I got from Jack as a reader was not that he was this Prince of Darkness as he calls himself, but rather that he was this really fascinating sort of self-defeating character, right? He has this litany of names that he calls himself, and it almost felt to me that he was driving himself towards this doom by naming himself in that way.
I think that's fair to say. He's certainly sealing himself in that doom, you know. And then he's also ironic in the sense that on the one hand, he has impulses that he recognizes as destructive. On the other hand, he is, by his own choice, someone who is really without much possibility for doing serious harm. You know, he secludes himself and so on so that he really doesn't have serious harm as an option in any circumstance that he anticipates. But of course, as things develop, that ceases to be true.
Right, and we learn fairly late in this book that he did, you know, in fact, in his past perpetrate a pretty serious act of harm against another person, right? And it seemed to me that once I had that revelation that he was sort of punishing himself for that. And that was one of the reasons he had put society at arm's length until he met Della.
Yes, I definitely think of him as trying somehow to pay the cost, you know, of what he did and what he regrets having done.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that he's sort of trying to, I guess, like pay penance to the wrong person, right? It's not to the person that he wronged, but he's putting that into this new situation.
Right, but he can't find the person he wronged.
It's very tragic. So I want to speak for a moment about this idea of perception that I think the book is really fascinated with. So Jack is deeply aware of how society sees him and how his self-image impacts the way people treats him. You know, the very first time that Della meets Jack, Jack is wearing this black suit and she mistakes him for a preacher, in fact. And he reacts to this so strongly that he, in fact, goes out, sells the suit, gets another suit that makes him look sort of like more disheveled and more of a ne'er-do-well. And there's this like hilarious moment where he's sitting in the new uglier suit, right, doing a crossword in the paper, and he knows that people are looking at him and assuming that he's gambling, right? So Jack is so obsessed with this idea of how he looks. And what I was really interested in as a reader was trying to figure out as I read how accurate Jack's awareness of his own self-image was, right? It was like, is he seeing himself realistically? Indeed, other people make these assumptions of him, or is he once again sort of such a cynic that he's kind of like bringing these negative reads onto himself?
I don't really know for sure. I mean, he is destitute typically, and he creates any image of respectability or anything that he has with difficulty. Understanding that he's on the margin of real haplessness and so on. Um, he it's part of his. He doesn't feel as though he doesn't feel. I mean, he's in a very large degree sort of the gentleman brought up by his father to be a gentleman. And at the same time, he is himself and aware that there's something ironic about what is pretentiousness or habit or so on about his, what other people might take as gentility. And then, uh, the gentility is offensive to people because it is, in a sense, fraudulent because he does nothing to support it, in terms of how society views him. And, all these things happen simultaneously within his self-consciousness, I think.
Jack has an extremely well-developed sense of humor and irony, and that's one of the things that I really loved about this novel, because I think it would be easy to tackle these topics with a heavier touch. But I do think that his sense of awareness, and also Della's sense of awareness, right? There's that moment when he calls himself like a prince of darkness again, and she says, "No, you're just someone that holds your socks." I believe. I really appreciated that throughout the novel, that there was this thread of awareness running through. There's this moment on page 74 in which Della says this really beautiful thing, and I quote, "I just think there has to be a Jesus to say beautiful about things no one else would ever see. The precious things should be looked to, whatever becomes of the rest of it." Now we know that Jack doesn't see eye to eye with what Della has just said in this moment, but he sort of lets her down gently, right? And in his head, he thinks, well, what she's saying, it's not harsh, but it's something worse. And I was really curious if you could shed any light on what he thinks of what she's saying at that moment.
Well, the book is about sort of the beauty of the interior experience, even when it's painful, even when it's ironic and self-satirizing. There's just a sort of brilliance in the whole problem of a mind conceiving of itself as a self, and trying to understand the meaning of how it acts and all the rest of it. So if you think of that as the major business of the world, if you think of these billions of people all with their heads humming with, attempts to articulate and understand and recall and retain and all the rest of it, that's the major business of the world. That's where most of the calories are spent, to put it crudely. And so any conception of reality that excludes the whole phenomenon of human consciousness, it seems to me radically incomplete. And the thing here I'm speaking, Della and I agree about a lot, but it seems to me as if what is missing from that understanding of reality is a perceiver, someone to whom what is beautiful, So, I think that she's probably making an argument that actually simply comes too close for Jack to be able to accept it, or to act as though he does accept it. He knows she's talking about him.
Yeah, I think that's what I sensed from him in that moment as well. There was like discomfort, almost maybe a sense of shame at being seen too close. And what's really, really interesting is I do believe that, obviously disagree with me since you read the book, but I do believe that Jack comes closer towards the end of the novel to accepting what she had said and to agreeing with what she had said. So there are quite a few times in the book that really jumped out at me where when Jack is under duress and he thinks of himself as a naked man. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I am always, I think I have always been most interested in characters when I could take them down to their sort of essential, bare forked animal humanity, and that, they're, within all the layers of accoutrement and so on that we can surround ourselves with and embalm ourselves in and so on, there is the essential, the Adamic simplicity of a human being. And he, because he's so aware of the artificiality or the dubious origins, in a sense, of every accommodation that he makes to society, he is thrown back again and again on this awareness of himself as Adam, as the naked man at the beginning of, the man uncomplicated in a certain sense, complex as he is, but that essential human being, human presence.
Right. And that's really beautifully said, but I got the sense that Jack is actually afraid of that, of sort of like looking straight on at his essential humanness. The way he thinks of his body, there's so much discomfort, right? He's always like sweating and then like wondering like where is the handkerchief so he can wipe the sweat off his face. He's like deeply aware of there's a scar on his face at some point, again, of like sort of the awkwardness of his physicality in different areas. I think with Jack being so uncomfortable with looking straight at that kind of core humanity, there is the sense for him that the body itself is betraying him.
The body is part of his problem, I mean, it's what anchors us to the earth after all, someone walking around upstairs.
Another body.
Yes, exactly. Gravity coming into play. But, when I use the illusion of Adam in those contexts, from the narrative that a large part of, the world has told itself repeatedly, is that there is an anxiety about that primal moment in it, about being naked, about making some crucial, not entirely comprehensible error, or, and so that's sort of how I think that if you talk in those terms about what is essential, you already have the sense of the body and the human presence as, something complicated, something not easily dealt with or lived in or whatever.
Mm-hmm. I think there's this really beautiful moment in which Jack, in his, I think, desire to sort of divest himself sometimes of a physical body, imagines he and Della as mixing irradiance, like the angels in Paradise Lost. And there is sometimes the sense, I think, that he wishes that he and Della could just, be out of this world.
That's really true. I mean, that's, I think that's graveyard influence thinking, but, it is society that creates these bizarre obstacles and potential insults and potential injuries and so on that they live among all the time. And if they could simply be themselves in some essential way without the encumbrance of readable social identity, that's what he's thinking about, what they think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I had that same thought when I was sort of stepping back and thinking about the structure of the book, which is really, really fascinating. I think, we're just thrown immediately from the introduction into the middle of a conversation, and we as the reader don't have the full context for how these two people came into this conversation. Actually, it's a little bit of a fight, right? How they came in, what happened right before. And I think, in fact, we don't even learn until maybe 2/3 through the book the exact factual details of how these two characters originally met. And I think my first experience, I was a little bit discombobulated by it. Like, it was lovely, it was beautiful, but I was wondering about that. And I think later I realized the book to me sort of had two parts, where the first part is like that initial conversation where Jack and Della, it's not that they're completely in a bubble because there are still other people, but it feels like the conversation truly gets to be about the two of them as human beings, as pure souls. And things are kind of quiet and dreamlike. They move, but they move a little bit slowly in a good way. And then in the second half of the book, there's this really fascinating sort of like picking up of pace where suddenly the two of them are barraged with like sort of like big event after big event, like external obstacle after external obstacle, right? There is a leader at the local church who objects to their relationship. Della's family objects to their relationship. She goes to Memphis, he goes to Chicago. Um, and so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about this structure.
You know, for weal or woe, I tend not to think of those things much. I have a feeling a critic or two may have pointed that out, but I always I write what seems proper to what seems to me to be suggested by what has come before. You know, their earlier contact is very tentative. You know, they're not sure of each other. You know, and then you know, when he happens to find his way to the pastor in the Baptist church, um, it's the first time that he's actually said out loud Della to anyone else. You know, um, there's as he realizes because of the minister's response to him the real seriousness, you know, of what they are engaging in. Not only serious because it's, you know, disrupts things that other people value and so on, but serious in the sense that no matter what anyone says to him, this is the fact, you know, that he cannot give her up, you know, um, and with, you know, with the awareness, I think that she would not give him up even then. But that when that happens, then there is I think, necessarily a kind of an acceleration.
Mhm. Yeah, and whether or not it was, planned going into it, I think there is something really lovely about that they have that Della and Jack are sort of allowed the dignity and the intimacy to sort of form those initially tenuous bonds without being known about by the outside world. And I think that is, to me, it's absolutely necessary to the way that the book functions. So I think it's brilliant, whatever other
Thank
critics
you.
um, on that note, it just occurred to me that, speaking of Jack and Della sort of just being just the two of them without other people being aware of their relationship, it's really fascinating because the first like good fifth of the book, that first conversation, it happens in the dead of night, right? In the most sort of secret of environments. And they actually have a lot of conversations, a lot of meetings like at night. That first scene is actually in a graveyard as well. And I was sort of curious because I think that those tropes of a graveyard, of nighttime, of a man following a woman, which is how the book starts out, are typically, coded as scary, as potentially violent, as ominous. But these aspects are not coded in that way in this novel. And so I was wondering, well, I don't know, do graveyards mean something different to you than they perhaps might to others?
Well, um, well, Della and Jack are both the children of clergy. They've both attended more funerals than average and so on. They've heard the narrative of human mortality and its meanings over and over again. They know that that love is embodied in the attentions that people give to the dead and so on. So just as they live in my mind, they would have had uh, less gothic perhaps sense of a place like that than most people would. But aside from that, um, they can be together without being disturbed, without being overheard. Um, and there just are not many circumstances under which that would be true for them. And they have lots and lots of time to get to know each other.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really lovely. And I will admit that I did not grow up religious, so my reading of graveyards is perhaps more gothic, as noted. Just speaking on that fact that both Jack and Della come from these religious families, I was curious if you could speak a little bit about the role of religion in their relationship. I think initially it serves as a bond between them, and indeed I don't know if that first interaction between the two characters would have happened had Della not mistaken Jack for a preacher, right?
Right.
But later, the church hinders them, arguably as much more than it sort of like helps them meet initially. So could you just, yeah, talk about the role of the church in their relationship?
Well, the church does, I mean, both of them feel very deeply that the love that they have between them is inviolable. It has it deserves immunity from arbitrary disruptions and so on, and from, from contempt and the other things that threaten it. The I would say that in both cases, the Baptist church and then the AME church at the end of it, they take the form of society in a certain sense. They take the form of either endorsing society or making defensive, arrangements over against society. The Dell is a treasure from their point of view. This school she talks about, Sumner, is the first Black high school west of the Mississippi. And there was, I mean, these things are incredible. There was a law against teaching Black children at the high school level. And so finally, a minister in St. Louis, a Black man, anchored a raft in the middle of the Mississippi River because it was illegal in both Missouri and Illinois to be teaching these kids algebra, basically, So he would row students out to this, and apparently the sort of moral authority of the act turned the minds of St. Louis, and they built what is really quite a lovely and impressive high school. But she is teaching in a situation where something, really new has happened. And I take her to be from Spelman College or somewhere like that. And she, she's a treasure. She's somebody who can, animate this wonderful new institution that's been created and so on. And she's leaving. She's doing exactly what will get her fired, So the objections that people like the Baptist minister have are, I think, highly understandable. And Jack understands them too. They fall solidly into the category of harm as far as he's concerned, that would affect even his own child as he considers it, So, and then her father, of course, is simply the mirror image of the Baptist minister. He's trying to create a new positive statement about Black culture, within the larger culture. And, again, his daughter would be a treasure in that context. And again, she's being lost to him, So, the churches are interfering in a way that, in one way, and in another sense, they're trying to defend something that you can see as being truly worthy of defense,
Right.
So I'm not dismissive of either of them.
Yeah, it almost seems from what you're saying that it might be that, again, the churches are sort of like, I mean, they're institutions, society, they're in some ways reflections of society. So it feels like their aims are almost larger than individuals, right? It's not like, what does Della want? It's like, again, what does Della contribute? What does she mean? What does she signify? I think that's actually, yeah, there's something Della actually says near the beginning of the novel about that, about her father sort of having less time for his family, his like individual family members, because of his role in the church and in the community. Yeah. Marilyn, did you ever live in St. Louis where the book takes place?
No, no, I have never lived there. I've traveled there a few times simply because I knew Jack, so to speak, lived in St. Louis, and I had to look at the place.
Did you have
Very Pardon?
No, go ahead.
I was just saying that it's very interesting in the way of old American cities, old industrial, heroic scaled American cities.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you, since this, I believe, is the first of the Gilead series to not be set in Iowa, if you had to do any special research in order to create this book that you didn't before.
I read quite a bit about, about St. Louis. And that's an actual cemetery, Bellefontaine. It's there. It's magnificent in a kind of funereal way, And it's also true that St. Louis was an important city in the Middle West in the 19th century. There were things about it, for example, the fact that it was a Union city, and it was very largely German. There were German surnamed generals who were very important because they could mobilize St. Louis and so on. So I was aware of it as an ethnically quite distinct and at the same time powerful, vital, necessary city, that was in a state that was a union state, but nevertheless had a regions in it that were very strongly pro-South. It's just so it's moving into another cultural environment from the point of view of Gilead.
Yeah, there is an urban feel to a lot of it. I mean, I think that the night scenes in particular that we talked about earlier feel so different in the context of a city than they do in a rural environment. And there is there is such a large cast of colorful secondary characters in the novel that sort of begin to exert those external forces on Jack and Della's relationship that I don't think you could have gotten in exactly the same way had it not been an urban setting.
I think you're very right about that.
Yeah, they're done with like a very deft hand. Some of them only appear for, a few paragraphs, but they're very memorable. Switching tacks for a little bit, and then I'll get to I see we have several audience questions. I'll get to those in a question or two. I wanted to ask for a moment about, the importance of Hamlet to this book and to Jack and Della's relationship. It's brought up a lot. They discuss it a lot. And I do believe that you were a scholar of Shakespeare at some point.
Yes, of an obscure early history play. It was a beginning.
Not Hamlet, exactly.
Not Hamlet, no. I approached him carefully over years of time.
That was actually my question, was that, I guess, which came first? Were you always interested in Hamlet, or did sort of you find these characters and then these characters sort of like informed your interest in Hamlet?
Well, I'm always interested in Hamlet, and I had been teaching at Yale Divinity School. I'd been teaching Shakespeare, and Hamlet was one of only 3 plays that we discussed in the class. So he was very much on my mind. It was very much on my mind from that point of view. But if people of cultural aspirations, however institutional or autodidactic, if they wanted to follow out these aspirations, they would read Hamlet, and perhaps very intelligently, Abraham Lincoln did that. And it seemed to me as if somebody looking at it from a little greater than usual distance would notice these gaps and anomalies that run all the way through the play. And so, it was simply a good way for them to talk together about something that they shared as something they were aware of.
Yeah, I love what you said about sort of, someone seeing these anomalies that you might not if you just studied it in a classroom environment. I think one that really struck me was when Jack has this moment where he has maybe a little bit of a perverse rereading of Hamlet. He's like, and I think, thinking about himself and Della, he wonders if Hamlet is in fact just a love story between the usurper King Claudius and the queen, right? And is it a love story where in fact it's just these 2 people in love who are overcoming every societally prohibited obstacle to be together? And that, it's still kind of ringing in my head because I've never, I first read Hamlet way too early in like elementary school at some point, and I've never thought of it that way. Is that reading one that you agree with or that you find interesting?
I find it surprisingly plausible, you know? I mean, part of what's so interesting about the play, of course, is that it will propose different solutions to itself over and over again. But the only real love relationship in that play is between Gertrude and Claudius, and it seems you have to take it on as a major fact.
That's true, because certainly the relationship between Hamlet and Ophelia is not a great love story.
No, no, that is snuffed out early and badly.
Yeah, that was just very fascinating to me. So thank you to you and to Jack for putting that idea in our heads. I now kind of wish that someone would do one of those modern day retellings of Hamlet, but maybe from Claudius's point of view. It'd be very interesting.
It would be very interesting. It really would.
Okay, so I'm going to take a moment and ask a few of the questions that the audience has left for you. So someone says, Marilynne, your work makes a beautiful case for seeing people in the reflections of their attachments. We may not love a person, but someone does. We may not imagine their laughter, but someone's heard it. Glory knows Jack one way, Ames another, etc. Is this emphasis on partial knowledge in your novels an encouragement to reflect on the idea of possibility? Do we love others better when we prioritize our imagination of others' attachments above our own, assuming the person is hard for us to love?
That's very interesting. I do think that we have to assume, I mean, when you see someone walking down the street, it's somebody's child grown up, probably somebody who people have earnestly prayed for, tended to, all the rest of it. And they're very, if you see them as a sort of repository of meaning of that love and so on, that being a human being necessarily involves. On the other hand, there are people for whom nothing of this kind has been done, and you have to love them for that fact. I think we take people as if they had no history, and by history I don't mean credentials, or I mean that they are invested with love and care and hope by people around them, or they are not, sadly enough. But in either case, this is the primary thing about them. This is what they are made for, and then we all grow up and we become difficult and all the rest of it, but we're still that human being. I think we should be, there's a great presumption, I think, that respect and gentleness are appropriate in every case.
Yeah, it's very beautifully said. Another person says, first of all, I would like to thank you for inspiring every Christian like me with the demonstration that great fiction dealing with Christian matters can still be written and widely acclaimed. What I'd like to ask is if you have ever thought of writing a probable final Gilead novel in which the son of Pastor John Ames gets to grow up to read the letter that is the novel Gilead, and what kind of life he would lead having his father's wisdoms passed on to him.
Well, of course, these characters flicker across my mind as potential narrators and so on. I'm not that particular. I think the odds are small, but then I once said I would never write one from Jack's point of view, so I'm really not an authority on the subject, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I feel like that's the truest answer that most writers can give. Another person asks, you were quoted recently as saying you don't get anxious. Do you think people are encouraged to define themselves as anxious rather than to accept and reflect on the meaning of their emotions?
Yes, I do. I think, frankly, that people are, for some reason, we're driving each other very hard, and a million things in the economy, especially, encourage anxiety in people that can override many, many other considerations. And so that, the best outcome is the worst that I feared didn't happen or something like that, whereas anxiety is always outwardly directed, and the things that we can actually give to society, give to one another, have to come from our, our own resources respectfully consulted, not put in the position of comparison with others or expectation in social or material terms, we don't, you know, I, I used to always tell my students that, a human brain is the most complex object known to exist in the universe, and you have one. And what does this mean? Well, obviously that you are intrinsically very interesting and very enjoyable if you make proper use of yourself. We're not encouraged to exploit the fact that we are intrinsically spectacularly interesting phenomena. There are some billion of us, and we act like that's a big thing. It's perishingly small by the scale of the universe. We're a tiny little flicker of light, we have to value ourselves more and value ourselves in a way that makes us value other people, because we're astonishing, and we need the space and the time to live out the fact that we are astonishing.
Thank you for that answer. I mean, yes, and I think every one of your novels sort of like has that at its heart, and that's part of why they're so extraordinary. So thank you for that answer. Someone else asks, for a newcomer to your work, in what order should we read your books? Thank you for your work.
I really hoped to make the books all freestanding so that anyone could be read first. So I don't give that particular kind of advice. I think people usually start with Gilead, but I did not intend that should be necessary.
Good answer. And then this one is for both of us. Somebody asks, what have you been reading lately that you might recommend?
Well, I've been preparing for a lecture I was invited to give on the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante. And this is a pretty new area for me. And I accepted, simply so that I could educate myself to be, worthy of the invitation. And I've been reading literature that surrounds him, other poets and philosophers and so on. It's very interesting. It really is another view of many things. And, so The Art of Courtly Love, or Scipio's Dream. Scipio's Dream of, my goodness, I've forgotten the title. In any case, you might be able to recommend things more immediately to hand.
Oh man, I'm trying to remember what I've been reading. I've actually been reading a lot of short story collections of late. I think it's just a little bit easier for my mind to focus on them. I've recently read this wonderful collection called A House is a Body by Shruti Swami. It came out very recently, and it's just, I don't know how to describe it because it's not, it's not trendy. It's not necessarily about current issues, but it's just everything I look for in a short story. They're just like elegant and strange, and I think in a way that's similar to your work, Marilyn, like very deeply attuned to like what makes each human life, if you look hard enough at it, very special and odd and like vibrating with its own energy. It's a great collection. And then there's this other collection by Mary South that came out earlier this year. I think it's called You Will Never Be Forgotten, that actually kind of goes the other direction, where it has these wonderful stories about living in the internet era and sort of the strange fallout of that. I highly recommend both of them. Okay, let's see. Another question for the both of us. So Marilyn, what has been your favorite comfort food throughout the pandemic?
Oh, ice cream.
I love how quickly that answer came as opposed to the book's answer.
Well, I've noticed a certain pattern in my behavior, let's say that.
My answer is actually similar. I've been eating a lot of dairy products, which is bad because I'm lactose intolerant. So I have to like take those little pills every time, but I've been eating a lot of mac and cheese and a lot of, also a lot of frozen desserts. Okay, another question for you, Marilyn. Many of your essays discuss faith or politics, and some of them explore their intersection as well. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has regularly used her faith to advocate for issues like healthcare and anti-discrimination. Do you see her as a good example of someone making a case that Republicans don't own Christian values? What's your impression of her?
Well, I admire her very much. I'm very reassured by the emergence of young people who are articulate and devoted and, one might say patriotic, over against other examples that claim that category, I think, which I would not concede to them. But yes, it's very, being religious myself, I cannot, I can't imagine anything more obviously true than that we are supposed to treat one another, with reverence, and we are supposed to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and visit the prisoner and all the rest, Um, where this other thing comes from, I simply I can't imagine. Um, it's a terrible loss. Christianity in this country, I think, historically has encouraged reform, and has encouraged a sort of optimistic dream of a better society, the kind of, like President Obama talks about, Um, this stupid name socialism has become affixed to everything that we do that amounts to a generosity toward ourselves, and everything that works virtually, in terms of sustaining the society. And of course, I admire her.
She's an incredible force. Yeah, another question for you, Marilyn. Does Iowa continue to inspire work in you, or do you feel you've exhausted it or become too accustomed / inured to it for it to inform you further?
Well, I don't know. Um, I would like very much to be able at some point to go back to Iowa. I feel a little bit, estranged here. I I would be surprised, frankly, if my fiction drifted too far from that landscape, because I've just thought about it for so many years and looked at it for so many years. It grows on you.
Yeah, and it does feel like there's always something new, right? I mean that in one sense. I also mean it in the sense that, were you there, Marilyn, when it flooded last year, or was it this year? I can't even keep track of time anymore.
No, me either. But I've been in the East for, months and months. I missed all the major events, even that crazy storm, Direco storm. Um, makes me feel guilty. I'm having survivor guilt.
I think we all are sort of. It's like in that time in the world where I feel like every person I talk to who has like any ounce of empathy has to start with like, I'm very privileged, and also I feel these like things and anxieties.
Exactly.
Yeah. Another question. I'm curious about how you developed the world of Gilead and where the story grew from. Did one particular character come to you first?
Well, I wasn't really thinking about writing fiction during the period when I know now that Gilead was forming. I was very interested in the Middle West, how it was settled, and that it was settled by abolitionists, which has had a very important effect on American history. And that is true, and it is also true that people have been talked out of that heritage. They have forgotten it. Um, and so um, I'm fascinated by that whole phenomenon of historical amnesia. Uh, I think we forget vastly more than we ever retain, even with all our careful archives and the rest of it. But people in Iowa, which was once the shining star of radicalism, have this idea that their being there makes them conservative, that they're loyal to something, that is deeply Iowan, in the fact of forgetting, in effect, never consulting the very great liberality of original founding. The Supreme Court of Iowa, before it was a state, outlawed segregation in schools, you know. The university was never been legally segregated, all that sort of thing. And there was, it's very important to Gilead, there was never a law against racially mixed marriage, which was unbelievably rare in the United States at the time, that there should be no law against miscegenation. And so Jack should be able to go home, you know, and he should be able to have his home be his son's home, you know, so they both know the same oak trees and so on. And he can't, because whatever is true legally is not true culturally. And he can't assume they would be welcome or safe there.
Oh man, Marilyn, I wish I could talk to you just for days about this. I think it's really been on my mind. That whole notion of, like, you called it historical amnesia. And I think for me, I was, you know, the book that I wrote is historical fiction, but I've just been sort of recently using the words history and myth in the American context more or less interchangeably, because I think that's often what we get instead of history is just like this myth, right? This idea that whatever Iowa is this conservative heartland. That's not, again, as you said, it's not real.
Right.
It's not in the roots, but it is this just like myth that gets perpetuated and, you know, gets distributed in this almost like freakishly virally quickly way.
And it becomes one mode of reality because it controls behavior and thought. Unbelievable. Yeah. And people don't even know how it happened or why it happened. And of course, it's true in many ways, in many places.
Yeah, okay. I won't take up all of our time talking about this because I know there are other questions, but thank you for that question, Oscar. Okay, next question. Someone wants to know if you think that grace is more embodied in the novel Jack than in your other novels.
Probably. I think that's probably true. The question, you know, I'm always veering around this question of predestination and so on, you know, which is associated with the theology that would have lain behind the ministers in Gilead that I describe. But I think that that the grace of God is the freedom of God, and that if you assume that God is free, you do not assume that you know the fate of any soul, including your own, you know. I think that that increasingly Jack experiences the reality of grace, even in the fact of experiencing the reality of unavoidable harm, you know. I'm not being very articulate, but I think that there's an incompatibility between the idea of predestination and the idea of grace, and that any conception of God that I can entertain means that grace is the actual reality.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Someone else asks, they know that you've had conversations with Barack Obama, and they're wondering if you can talk about your relationship with him.
Well, you know, we exchanged letters through most of his presidency. Wonderful, treasured letters. And then he left office, and I started writing a book, and he started writing a book, and I had a wonderful conversation with Malia, and you know, somehow or other, I just sort of lost confidence in the, you know, in the way in which we had exchanged letters, because so many other things had changed. But he was very, very kind to speak about me in the profile that was done by the New Yorker a little while ago. He's always, and he made a DVD of so that he could speak at my retirement event and so on. I mean, to the extent that probably he can find me, he has showered me with kindnesses, and I just think he's a wonderful man.
Well, I have no doubt that he's going to be reading Jack if he hasn't already.
Well, I'll be fascinated to hear what he thinks.
Okay, there are two more questions here. So one of them is, what other works, TV, film, or books do you feel like your book is in conversation with?
Well, in a way, I think that my attempt to have a part in the conversation about race relations in the United States, a lot of, I mean, I've read enough history to be very impressed by how many really remarkable things were done by Black people during the period when every obstacle was raised against them. And I have a book that's a translation of Philip Melanchthon's major work, done by a Black scholar, published in 1945, and it's still the book of its kind. It's still the translation of Melanchthon, a very, very important document. And I mean, it's no small thing. It's amazing. I don't know under what circumstance he did it, but what a thing to do. Um, there's a sort of way of the most sympathetic cultural imagination of Black people basically eliminates the whole top stratum of their achievement, which seems like, I mean, for example, making this AME Bishop character in the novel, there were great clergymen. They seem to be unacknowledged. The greatness, the importance of things that were done by that culture, despite every obstacle, is something that ought to be known and honored and is ignored. And so I wanted to create a world in which the assumed power relations were inverted, so that, well, you can see why.
Yeah, I do think there's just so much film, literature, art, books that are about that nowadays, which is just like wonderful.
Mhm.
And then this final question from the audience: do you see Jack as part of yourself or quite exterior?
Oh, he's part of myself. There's no question.
Would you say that of every main character that you've written?
Yes, I would say that about all of them. With Jack, one of the things that is striking to me, um, I've had a very fortunate life in the sense that I've always fallen into a niche where I could flourish. But I think if I had to live another kind of life, I would have starved to death or gone crazy. I I have a fairly keen awareness of the fact that a lot of people are better at many aspects of life than I am. And that strange sort of discomfort. How does this city work? How does this all hang together? All that sort of thing. I definitely identify with that.
Yeah, I think we can all identify a little bit with that part of Jack. All right. I think that's it from the audience. Thank you so much, Marilyn, for just showering us with your wisdom and your insights about your novel.
Well, thank you, Will. You're a great interviewer. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Well, I'm back. I just wanted to say thank you so much to Pam, to Marilyn, for the great conversation tonight. We really appreciate it. I know the audience really appreciated it. Marilyn, thank you so much for your time. Pam, thank you so much for making this evening happen. I want to say thank you on behalf of the Wisconsin Book Festival, but also for the three other people who do my job who helped make tonight's event possible: Amanda Bullock from the Portland Book Festival, Steph Opitz from Wordplay in Minnesota, and Sara Ortiz from the Believer Festival. We also want to invite you to come back to many of our festival events. The Wisconsin Book Festival has events all throughout October and some into November. The Portland Book Festival takes place in November, all online. And we are working together again on November 16th for an event with Claudia Rankin for her new book, Just Us. She'll be in conversation with Jericho Brown. We hope that you'll come back for that and many, many more events over the next couple of weeks. So thank you again, Pam. Thank you again, Marilyn. This was absolutely lovely, and we are intrinsically and spectacularly interesting. Thank you for that. I will say that over and over and over again. Have a lovely night.
Nice.